Afternoon. It's nice to connect and reconnect a bit and see some people I haven't seen in quite a while, so really appreciate that. Plus meeting some new folks, that's always good. And just a couple items kind of before I start. I do work part-time at the Minokan farm, and those of you that, maybe some of you have been there, but in the indigenous local language, it means you reap what you sow. And so I thought that was an appropriate name, because the community of Minokan is right there as well, a real small community just east of Bismarck. And so this allows us a place where you can kind of go and fail, and you can reevaluate, reapply, and you can eventually make something move. And so it's also a place where you can monitor soils, you can learn a bit more about carbon, and it's an area that we host maybe on the average, I'd say about 35 groups a summer. And so these groups come from anywheres. And it's a safe environment to come to and talk about. No one's going to judge your system. And it's just a place where you can go and visit about how soil health principles can fit your situation. No one's going to try to talk you into anything, but we are going to show you what's been working and what hasn't been and share those experiences with you. So earlier today, somebody won the door prize of a spade, right? I don't know if that person's in the room or not, but that person was the big winner, okay? That's the big winner. Even if it isn't seasoned, I like that conversation they had on because there was some soil on it, so they called it seasoned. I like that. But the soil is such a huge thing that can be used as a tool. But I think the reason a lot of farmers, some do, some don't, but a lot of them don't use a spade is because when you take up that spade of soil and you look at it and you kind of go, oh, okay. But the key to it is you need some comparison. You know, maybe something out of the woodland, maybe some soil out of the fence line, maybe out of some grasslands, maybe out of cropland, maybe cropland that grew a cover crop that year, and it starts to kind of come into focus, okay? So whoever got the spade, my feeling was they got a pretty good deal. So a couple other items, there was some conversation earlier too about evaluating on your farm, etc. Something I've always tried to do over time when working with any farmer, I like to archive the soils when you start. And I like putting that in a container, labeling it. You can GPS it or put a legal on it or a field name on it, pop some holes in that plastic pail with the lid on, put it under the workshop counter, and someday go back to that soil. So if you're ready to start something, you're going to start a new field, manage grazing, or you're going to add cover crops to a cropping system, something of that nature, consider that. Archive the soils. I think it's a nice way to start. It's not really going to cost you anything. And someday go back and open that lid up again and compare it to the field where you took it from. So just some thoughts of things that you can do if you choose to. So that was one of the items that came up that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. I think the other item I wanted to bring out before I started is, why do we till?
For fun.
Fun, recreation. Anyone else? Addiction. Eliminate variables. Okay. That's 4.
We can buy a bigger tractor.
Bigger tractor. 5.
Get the soil to warm up.
Get the soil to warm up. Kill weeds.
Improve water infiltration.
Improve water infiltration. Okay.
Generational habits.
Generational. Yeah, it's like a culture, right? It's something your forefathers did, if you will. Okay. The neighbors, that's part of the equation. So something I learned over the years, a lot of you know Dwayne Beck at Dakota Lakes Research Farm, Pierre, South Dakota, or know of him. And very early on in my career, he took me aside one day. He said, you know, Jay, why we till? And I said, well, I probably don't know the answer. I'm just about to hear from you. But I said, let me know your thoughts. He said, we till soils for the same reason we frack oil wells. So you frack an oil well in the Bakken oil field in North Dakota to increase oil production. We frack a soil because you get more release. And so he said you get more release of nutrient. So I think we, as a human race, we have a tendency to always kind of go back to fracking a soil whenever something maybe doesn't go the way we thought it should. And so I don't think it's so uncommon that we've seen it over the years. Those are just some thoughts. So my two talks are going to be connected. So the first one is soil regeneration on my farm, and tomorrow is going to be what are you looking at? And they do blend together, and they are intended to connect a bit. So we'll get started with this one. So in the opening, I like a little geology because it helps me understand where I'm at. So if I'm going to work someplace, and it's not in North Dakota, I read the geology a bit first, okay? And you can take whatever with a grain of salt, but in North Dakota, I've always used the Geological Legacy book. It was written by our state geologist. He was really good, and he was there for a number of years. There's things in there, like for instance, I just mentioned the Bakken oil field. So there's things in there, let's see if I get my glasses on here, about the Bakken oil field. Well, 359 million years ago, the Bakken Formation. Okay. But North Dakota was then located at the equator. So we have to put all this kind of into an understanding. And then plate tectonics eventually one day shifted continents and the location changed. But at that time, it was located near the equator. And then you got things like 200,000 years ago, if we keep going down, 200,000 years ago talks about humans started looking like they do today. Now, I could probably argue when I go to Bismarck's Walmart, they don't maybe, but you know, you got to put it in context, right? You put it in context. So, and Dr. Bloomley was very good at telling us these are approximate. You know, he said these are as close as we can get. These are approximate, but they're close. So then I understand the earliest flooding for Lake Agassiz. Well, that's Fargo, Grand Forks, Winnipeg. That was a huge area, okay? So we start to understand that flooding, earliest flooding, though it was 14,000 years ago. Last active glacial ice was 11,000 years ago. So North Dakota was glaciated a half a dozen times. So we had glaciers come through there a number of times over the years, reset our soils. So our soils are actually a fairly young series. And then the water eventually drained off, okay? Lake Agassiz drains for the last time 8,300 years ago. So Lake Agassiz, that whole flat area of eastern North Dakota into Canada. And then, you know, we get closer. We get 220 years ago, Lewis and Clark came through. Well, if they would have called up to that Cavalier, North Dakota area, they could have called ahead for a sit-down dinner. Because the fur trade was big there, and people were starting to grow their own vegetables, starting with potatoes in that part of North Dakota at that time. So we start to put that into perspective, okay? And then bonanza farms in North Dakota, mid-1870s. So huge areas. And we're kind of almost going back to them. So the Minokan farm is 150 acres, but my neighbor is 40,000 acres, my neighbor next door. So now we're like back to a bonanza farm again, right? But we've been to bonanza farms before. We've been there before. We're just kind of reinventing them. And then if you look at, statehood, 135 years ago, and I was born 70 years ago. So now I got a little context on my geology and the time frame, okay? So one of the earlier speakers in this room, one of the breakout sessions talked about critical civilization, or civilization critical rather, by Darren Qualman. Darren Qualman, kind of a farmer type out of Saskatoon. And so I know him a bit, and he wrote this book. So there's two symbols. If you're good at symbols and good at arrows, there's two symbols. One represents that 200,000 years ago when humans were hunter-gatherers. And one of the symbols represents the last 100 years of agriculture. Which is which?
The top one is the last one.
Yeah, the linear line is the last 100 years, because now we've gone into that linear agriculture a number of years ago. And if there isn't enough comes out of the end of that linear pipe, what do we do to the other side of the pipe? We put more things into it, right? So when it comes out, if we don't get enough coming out of that linear line, we put more in on the input end of it. The bottom one was a recycle system. And so we recycled. For most of man's existence, we recycled. But the last 100 years, we've made it a bit more linear. And then I've seen this over time, after monitoring soils for 40-some years. I've seen when we have really our plant and animal diversity, as it goes down, I've seen our tillage go up. And so those are just my observations, okay? But I've seen this happen. And so if we grow one crop, one cash crop, or maybe two, generally speaking, you're going to see some disturbance in that system. It wouldn't be unusual, especially if the animal component was taken off as well. And then two quotes. So a Kansas farmer that emails me now and then says, the top quote, "Seems like the only thing that I've ever done to really change soil and increase yields is to use diverse cover crops and graze cattle on the covers." Well, that's kind of crazy talk, right? Why would that be? So then you get into the why. That cover crop's going to give off a carbon exudate into the soil. First 4 to 8 weeks of a green plant's life, it's going to give off sugars into the soil. Okay? So we know this happens, and that's one of our bigger sources of carbon coming directly into the soil. When you hear carbon, always think food. Okay? So it's food for the biology. And then the bottom one I thought was pretty good too. If you have wind and water erosion along with water quality and quantity all addressed, then you can get as fancy as you want. I thought that's pretty good also. And so you get things stabilized, you get them functioning, you don't have erosion, you have good things happening, get as fancy as you want. I like that one as well. And then we know the livestock end of it, when we revert back to what built our soils. Okay, after the glacier drained off, and we actually had a few thousand years of perennial plants and ruminants, it built these soils. In our case, it built mollisols. That's a really, really nice soil to work with. And when we revert back, so that particular slide shows in October of 12, it shows what happened before it got seeded to a perennial grass. Okay, soil organic matter was 2.8, and you can see on the base saturation, not really good numbers. And then in December of 17, I took it again after a number of years to manage grazed. And of course, the pH starts to go back to neutral. Soil organic matter starts to tick up a bit, and our base saturation starts looking way different, okay? So these are all aspects of it that we know when we go back to what built our soils changes things. So we went into multi-species perennials, managed grazed, and that's very similar then to what built our soils. So which of the following is your farm? So are you cold? Is your farm cold? Or is it too cold? This one is us. You can see the birds in the flyway, right? That's us right there. We're cold, okay? Not unusual. But sometimes we get hot, and especially when we have bare soils like this, okay? So this is a farm I might as well tell you I failed on once or twice, okay? Wasn't able to sway anyone with my suave debonair personality. Just failed, okay? Sometimes you do. But there you got really hot, and we had a lot of soil move, and we lost a lot of phosphorus, because every time you have wind erosion coming off of these fields, you got phosphorus transport. How about this one here? Are you too wet? So this may or may not be closely related. Someone asked the question this morning of this morning's speaker, Russell, when he was speaking, asked about something about the Haney analysis nitrogen didn't correlate to this field. And if I understood it correctly, I think it was kind of a wetter environment field. Where do you think a lot of this nitrogen is going? Nitrous oxide, right? So you're losing a lot of nitrogen to nitrous oxide. So would it not make some sense that it's probably not going to show up exactly in some analysis? Because it got redirected a bit, right? So if we can put a green plant on here and grow out the water, that starts to make a big difference. And so a green plant could grow out the water. So on that water quality, just to touch on an item, I just kind of want to show you, this is some work that we did at the Minokan farm a few years ago. If you start looking at, even on the top on field 1, you'll notice that there's inorganic in and organic in, okay? And so if you look at that on a perennial field, it wouldn't be uncommon in this environment that you're going to have about a third of your nitrogen is in an inorganic form, plant available. And about 2/3 of it's in an organic form, okay? So that's more of a slow release. And then if you go down the page, you get into, well, wheat with no cover crop. Now it flips. 2/3 of it becomes inorganic, 1/3 becomes organic. And so we start to see that whole environment, and when we start bringing in planting green, so on the bottom of the page, you notice the soybean planted green. So when we plant a crop green, then we go back to roughly 1/3 of it being inorganic, 2/3 of it being organic. And it's a big water quality item. And so when you come to fall, if you don't have a green plant, where do you think that plant available inorganic in is going to go? It's not going to stay just waiting for you for the next year. If you can get it into a green plant, and then we start to get more cyclic, like we showed on Darren's symbols, you start to get more of a circle for recycling. So you can use it over and over and over. Whereas if we don't have that, we start to lose it, or when we have a wet environment like that and we have nitrous oxide issues. So, same scenario, that last perennial field again, repeat scenario, about 1/3 inorganic plant available when we're in a perennial. And so it tells us some things. And then on this whole water scenario, I always think in terms of guttation water, which is what comes out of the hydathodes in the early morning, not dew, but if you have water coming out of the hydathodes, it went up the xylem, okay, because your stomata is closed. And then if you look in the center, that's transpiration. That's where we really like water to be going, because transpiration buys us something. And we try very much to avoid evaporation. And so one of the earlier speakers talked about salinity, and salinity is, for us in the Dakotas, is a big issue because we were geologically underwater for a long time. And so then you have geological salts in your soils, and if you have evaporation, that will sooner or later come and bite you pretty hard. Whereas if you move your water through transpiration and guttation, those aren't issues. So it's all things that you find your way on your environment. So let me see if I have... That's us. So on the right side is a neighbor that decided vertical tillage would be a good idea before he planted beans. On the left side is the Minokan farm planted green beans in the dead litter. Okay. One of those fields moved. This was a 3-day wind Blew like that 3 days. That's us. Large scale environment, nothing to stop it. And so when we have that scenario and you have soil like that moving, that's a huge phosphorus loss. So unless they're giving phosphorus away in Minnesota, they aren't in North Dakota. We try to recycle that phosphorus. Most of the phosphorus we've applied over the last 50 years is still in the soil, but it's not released. You have to have biology to make that available. And so, but when we have wind erosion, the phosphorus is locked onto the clay colloids. And so the microscopic clay colloids, you can't see them when they leave the field unless you get enough of them to gather, then you can visibly see them, okay? So fortunately, nothing like this ever happens in Minnesota. So I'm glad, okay? But this does happen in a lot of other places other than Minnesota, okay? In virtually every other state. And so, but the phosphorus is a huge issue. And so this has become a real resource concern for us. So we used to have more of this. You know, our number one crop is soybean, has been for a number of years. Soybean's not evil, but it is a very low carbon crop, and it is a very low residue crop. And it gives us very little cover as we've increased its frequency. We used to have more spring wheat, we used to have more field pea. These are two fields that we still grow at the Minokan farm, but they're secured environments because we have armor, we have cover, either dead litter or green, okay? The whole erosion issue thing, the interesting thing is now we've been into no-till systems for a long time in parts of North Dakota, other parts not. And the interesting thing is we've seen an increase now in erosion in no-till systems. And these are no-till systems, but they are primarily low carbon, and they are no cover crop and no livestock. And so you look at that whole scenario, we don't have enough armor to stabilize the soil surface. That doesn't mean they won't be beans again the next year. And so that's a resource concern that's difficult to deal with, but we definitely need to. So a little bit on respiration, especially carbon dioxide. You know, most of those carbon dioxide and the other elements are all collectively together are 1%. And so just some things that you can look at. Usually about 0.035 is the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's about 450 parts per million. If you have a meter, if you got a CO2 meter, probably be around 450, 460. So you can see that 0.35 on the left side. Well, the soil air is going to be 10 times that, okay? So soil air is going to be much higher level than that. And then as you go down the profile, that drops off, right? But the oxygen drops off. The nitrogen, not really, because the nitrogen has a tendency to be very stable, whether it's in the upper or even the midsection. But the oxygen, of course, drops off as you go down the profile until you become anaerobic. But the carbon dioxide in wherever you have aggregates, pore spaces, that'll be 10 times higher. And so 460 parts per million CO2. What's your breath? How much CO2 is in your breath when you exhale, or when you talk to a green plant? Anyone in here talk to a green plant? No? No one will admit it? Maybe over the social. So if you talk to a green plant, you'll have people tell you that that flower or that plant will respond. Well, in your breath, there's about 35,000 parts per million. That's a lot different than 450 parts per million that's in the atmosphere. And so, yeah, because the plants like that biological food. And then I look at some things too, like Solvita in the respiration. So does water respire? You know, so I took city water, rainwater, and I took leachate from our vermicompost, and I took 2 levels of leachate. And then you put the paddle in for 24 hours, gives you a reading, okay, on respiration. And the city water had just a slight reading. Well, why would we want city water to be about zero? That's potable, right? And we need that so that we can safely drink it, right? But this water came about 15 miles from the Missouri River to the Minokan farm, and it went in through the pipe systems, came out of a faucet, and then went into a container, and then it finally read it. So it had a little bit of reading in it. Rainwater a little bit more, so there's definitely respiration from biology. And then, of course, the leachate, same scenario. And then if you take the corn roots or wheat or whatever crop and you put them in, you'll get a very similar scenario. There's a huge amount of respiration in the root mass. Okay? It's good to do it to see what this comes out to, and we start to look at it, and we get the reading after about a 24-hour period. And then I want to touch on soil a bit, and here's something that I went, Bismarck State College is a 2-year college. It's an energy school. If you want to work in the energy fields in North Dakota, it's a good college to go to. They'll prepare you for it. They also got a small ag section, and they said the other day, we need soil, because we're going to run some things, and they said, would you bring us some? I said, absolutely. So I had these pails of soil in the kitchen table at home, and I'm looking at them, and I thought, well, look at that, so I'll show you. So this pail, I took out of a field 8 at the Minokan farm. There's no cover crop on it, okay? That's not a horrible field, right? That's not bad looking dirt, right? That's not bad. Okay, no cover crop. The next field I'm going to show you was next to it, and it had a cover crop, same soil type, darkened a little bit. Why? A little more carbon coming in. Got to have a green plant to bring carbon in. And then I had the third one, multi-species cover in 60-inch corn. Look at that go to town. And so you can visually see these. I mean, it was very apparent when you were looking at them. You can visually see them. And then I do some, I'm a foundational person, and I don't like spending money on analysis, so I do a lot of things that we can do that don't cost us much. One of them is called VES. It's the Visual Evaluation of Soil Structure. And it's 1 through 5, 1 being the best soil, 5 being the worst soil, okay? So you want 1s and 2s if you can. You try to avoid 4s and 5s. Things aren't going well if you got 4s and 5s. And it's visual and it's feel, okay? And so you follow the procedure. It's just a 2-page document. It's pretty straightforward. And then in addition, I sieve them. So I have 2 sieves there, a 1 millimeter and a 2 millimeter. You put them on top of each other and shake the bejesus out of them, and you get a nice uniform aggregate, as you can see in the photo there. And then I look at them when I get them lined up. And so I got 10 fields at the Minokan farm. I got 10 fields right there. Took them all out with a steel spade, so you get a full, nice, about a foot or better profile. And then you can compare them to each other and then go through the VES. And so it's a good exercise to know, and it's a hands-on. And then on the top, you go ahead and sieve them, and you put them in put the aggregates in water, and then you see how stable they are. So that works. And then I'm always trying to build back the resource. So we've simplified it over time, right? And so we used to have lots of native rangeland in the Dakotas, native grass, and it was 100+ species per acre, okay? And we replaced it one day with cropland, and how many species per acre did we replace it with? 1, right? 1 at a time each year. So you can see when you had 100 species, they're all giving a different exudate, different carbon exudate, and now you went to cropland. That's a tough game to match, right? Because the perennial grasses were also much deeper rooted. So beetle banks are something that I've added in the past year, and they're very helpful. And the beetle bank is, it's a form of biological pest control. And it's fairly effective. It goes out about 750 feet in all directions. And so it's a matter of coming together with, first of all, recognizing which beetles that you want to, you're looking at picking something out. In this case, I picked out beetles. And so the beetles want the perennial clump grasses because they complete parts of their life cycle in the perennial grasses. And then I thought, well, we might as well add some flowering plants, flowering forbs as well. So we picked out 5 grasses and 5 forbs, all native to the Bismarck area. And we ordered them as plugs. So I didn't have, because when you get older in life, you don't like messing around with seed. I want a plug, because I want to be able to get a jump start on it. And so then you can go ahead and set up your environment. Your beetle bank needs a little raise in the center, slight raise. It needs to be at least 6 feet wide, and it can be any length, okay, any length. And then you go ahead and you start these plants. And you start to learn a little bit about the beetles. And some of you are thinking the 60s, okay? Not those beetles, okay? These are different beetles, right? And so you start to understand, you know, and you get into the whole scenario with the egg, larvae, pupae, adult. And then I picked the ones on the left to learn about. There's so many, but you got to start somewhere, right? And especially for the grazers, you know, we talk about the dung beetles, okay? Well, let's learn a little bit more about them. And these all perform services for us, but they need a home, because we've kind of taken the home away, right? And so I'm trying to bring back home and a food. And these are the ones that I'm going to educate myself on a bit more. And you start to understand how they function, and you start to understand their life cycles, okay? So I want to touch on, I still do, you know, I work part-time, but I still do a little foundational soil analysis work or soil foundation work on some operations. And so this first one I thought was pretty interesting because we had the National Association of Conservation Districts, their annual summer tour was at Bismarck this year. And we ended up out at Black Lake Ranch. And it's a large ranch. And we went out the day before and identified about 25, 30 plants, flagged them, okay? And these buses are coming and everybody's walking out there and we're standing there. That's my foot there. And I'm standing in an area and all of a sudden I look down and, well, there's the monarch. And of course it's doing the slow, if you watched monarchs after they first are kind of born, there's a slow wing movement. They're drying their wings because they can't fly yet, right? They got to dry their wings. So he's sitting there, he's totally at my mercy because he can't go anywhere. And he's doing his wings. And the people are walking over. And as they gather up, it was like it was choreographed, you know. But here's a monarch just hatched. And of course, there's 3 different types of native milkweed we had just identified, and I just happened to pick that area to stand in. And all the native plants we identified, but 3 different types of milkweed. And so all of that goes away if that gets converted to cropland, and it's not there anymore. And so, but it really gave a good example of what it can be. And it also, you start to understand, you know, the cattle don't typically graze milkweed. You know, it's a bit bitter for them, a bit toxic for them if you ate enough of it. But it protects the monarch, right? That's what protects them from birds. And so it was just a nice example, so I wanted to share that with you. And then this is Prairie Hills Ranch, southeast of Bismarck a little bit. And this is 1,000 yearlings grazing on multi-species covers. And sometimes people talk about why you want to bring livestock in, and it is one of the soil health principles. And I thought this illustrates it so well. So let's talk about the why of livestock. So these livestock are grazing a multi-species cover crop, so it's kind of mimicking what built these soils. But it could have been corn, because this is cropland. It could have been a corn year, could have been a bean year. And if there's no livestock, after harvest, that crop residue has to go through decomposition before you're making food available to the soil food web. But if you bring livestock in, even after corn harvest or even after bean harvest, when you bring livestock in, the ruminant makes food available for the soil biology day 1. That's a huge difference on when the refrigerator door opens Okay, that's a big difference. Plus they spread the biology because they're walking and distributing. They got legs. That's a great thing about them. Also, this is the bean field at the Minokan farm. I wanted to show you where the previous year it was a perennial. We have rotational perennials. So the previous year it had just been coming off 5 years rotational perennials. Can you see where the electric fence was? Yeah, not hard to do. The livestock didn't graze right under that fence. They grazed up to it on both sides. Aren't they amazing? So it really shows what can why they're a principle, right? Why they are good at building the soil. And this is a kind of a longtime friend, colleague of mine, Brendan Rocky, Center, Colorado. He's a potato farmer in the San Luis Valley. It's a desert. He's at a high elevation, but he has brought diversity into his potato production. So he has plant diversity with the potatoes and next to the potatoes, okay? And so this has allowed him to reduce insecticides, fungicides, etc. Okay? It also allowed him to reduce irrigation water use. The following year, it's multi-species covers, managed grazed with livestock. Year after that, back to potatoes. But he's really the apex. But the one thing I wanted to point out is he and Lauren prepared a table for Kathy and I, and we had dinner in the middle of the potato field in the evening. You know how many potato fields in North Dakota you want to sit in and have a dinner in? Well, you don't, because they're on a clock for all of the pesticide applications. And so they're put on every 7 to 10 days. Do you want to sit out there and have dinner? That doesn't happen here. So that was the gist of that. We had dinner in a potato field. That's pretty unusual. I enjoyed that. So this is another item I wanted to bring out to you. If you can see the difference, can you see the difference in these two spades, the soil in them? You notice the one on the right, the one I'm holding, the white spade, notice how dark it looks? And the other is right beside it here. One of them has all of this crop diversity over quite a few years. One of them doesn't have crop diversity, okay? Plus it has soil disturbance. Is there a difference? And so when we get into this for the long haul, and we have enough diversity, got to have, because diversity is kind of the holy grail, you're going to have that, okay? And then one of our grocers, you might have read about the Lazinskis, Deanna and Kelly Lazinski. They are somewhere between Minot, North Dakota and Bismarck, and they supply us with things like flour and barley for cereals, etc. So they're one of our grocers, and they're really good at what they do. But again, if you look at what do they grow, they have diversity, and so diversity makes these things happen. Also want to mention some books. The one I'm reading right now is that top one, The Soil, Human Health Nexus. It's a pretty good book. So you might want to give that one some thought. I just asked Kathy to order it on her magical phone, and then it arrives on our porch magically from Amazon or someplace. And that saying about the larger Amazon, no, how does it go? Yeah, the larger Amazon gets, the smaller the Amazon gets. Yeah, I think it's probably pretty true. But there's a number of soil books in here that I think you would enjoy. That third one down, The Buffalo Harvest, it's really a good book about what occurred when we harvested out all of the bison in North America. And there was a good public TV editorial on it the other night as well, out of Bismarck. And it's a little bit, you get to the end of that editorial and you ask yourself, is this us? Man. And then you go, yeah, it probably is. So there's a number of good books on there. the geology that I started out with, man, if you get a chance to start with geology, it's a great place to start for understanding who we are. It's a great place to take a look at. Then you can move into some real basic things with soils. And if you got your erosion controlled and you got water quality and quantity controlled, get as fancy as you want, right? Then there's lots of things that you can move into. But then you have a foundation, and you know where you're at. And I think those are all really good. But these are all things, you know, my past has been one of monitoring systems. So I monitored systems when we were in the 80s in full tillage mode in the Dakotas. I monitored them when we moved into the no-till systems. And one day I gave a talk to a group and I made this comment, and I said, after 12 years, when we had moved into our no-till systems, and we had diversity then, and we also had high residue crops like wheat yet then, but we didn't have covers yet. We had no cover crops yet. And I made the comment, I said, after 12 years, a lot of our producers have achieved 1% gain in soil organic matter. So I get a scathing letter shortly after, and the individual did the math and showed me that that's impossible. He said, you can't do that because here's the math, okay, on crop production and weights and decomp and then what you could, what was known at that time. So I dug that letter out the other day just to refresh my memory. Not that I hold, you know, grudges or anything and keep letters from people. I don't do that. But I dug that letter out the other day, and of course there was no talk in there because we didn't know at that time what the carbon exudate contribution even was. We didn't even know that, okay? And there was no comment in there on that portion of the carbon, which is probably one of the more major portions, okay? And so we've come a long way. And it isn't that what we learned over the years, whether it was in formal education or whether it was on the job, it wasn't that it was wrong. It's maybe more that it's incomplete. And we've been adding segments as we unravel along the road. When I think back 45 years, we didn't know anything about carbon 45 years ago to speak of in comparison to today. So, yeah, so if there's a question.